Welcome back to Hidden in the Stars. Although it's been 56 years since the event, it appears that the authenticity of the Apollo 11 moon landing is once again in question, this time by reality TV star Kim Kardashian. After I recovered from the headache I got from rolling my eyes too hard at her assertion that the event was faked, I began to wonder, why do some people think the moon landing was a hoax? How many people still feel that way? And what is the evidence for both sides of this argument? A quick glance at survey data reveals that the vast majority of Americans believe that astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong did indeed land on the moon on July 20th, 1962. According to a polls survey in 2021, 71% believed it to be true, 17% weren't sure, and 12% thought it was fake. So let's take a trip back to the 1960s to look at the facts. It's April 1961, and the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union has been in progress for over 5 years. This is taking place in the backdrop of the Cold War, a decades long geopolitical rivalry between the two countries that began in the aftermath of the Second World War. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin has just become the first person to orbit the Earth in the Vostok 1. 5 days later, the U.S. launches a failed invasion into Cuba that came to be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Smarting from these two smackdowns, President John F. Kennedy tasks Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson with exploring ways for the U.S. to beat the Soviets to the moon. In a speech on September 12, 1962, Kennedy says, quote, "To be sure, we are behind, and will be behind for some time in manned flight. But we do not intend to stay behind, and in this decade we shall make up and move ahead. No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space."
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Chosen for the Apollo 11 mission are Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins. Launching at 9:32 a.m. local time, the rocket consisted of three parts: the service module, the command module named the Columbia, and the lunar module named the Eagle. This is where the phrase, "the Eagle has landed," comes from. Michael Collins remained aboard the Columbia during the mission, while Aldrin and Armstrong boarded the Eagle for the trip to the lunar surface. Armstrong was the first to set foot on the moon with his famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." It has been debated whether he said man or a man. I chose to put in a man. Either way, the moment was historic. 19 minutes later, he was joined by Buzz Aldrin, and they planted the U.S. flag in the lunar soil. This is another point of contention, as some people believe that the flag can be seen waving as if in a breeze, which would not be expected in the moon's atmosphere. This point has been debunked by pointing out the horizontal component to the flagpole, with the wrinkled nature of the flag explained by its compact packing on the lunar module. The astronauts collected 47.5 pounds of lunar material, which has been confirmed to be valid by laboratories all over the world. The men even participated in the first extraterrestrial phone call by speaking with then President Richard Nixon. After about 21.5 hours on the lunar surface, the men lifted off in the Eagle to rendezvous with the Columbia, which had remained in orbit with Michael Collins, for the return flight to Earth's atmosphere, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th. The returning men were welcomed as heroes across the country. So where, you may ask, is the controversy? For conspiracy theorists, the evidence of the moon landing being faked tends to fall into one of four categories. First is the convenient timing of the landing in the middle of the space race with the Soviet Union. Scientists are quick to point out, however, that the Soviet Union would have loudly cried foul had there been evidence of a fake. No one is disputing the competitive nature of the race, with Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov stating, quote, "I can positively state that the Soviet Union will not be beaten by the United States in the race for a human being to go to the moon. The US has a timetable of 1969 plus X, but our timetable is 1969 plus X minus 1. After the Apollo 11 flight, Soviet journalist Yaroslav Golovanov claimed that at first, quote, secrecy was necessary so that no one would overtake us. But later, when they did overtake us, we had to maintain secrecy so that no one knew we had been overtaken. In fact, the Apollo 11 landing was listed in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia as the third most important space event ever, after Sputnik and the flight of Yuri Gagarin, although that source was not able to be verified. Also, in line with conspiracies regarding the timeline, doubters cite the necessity of distracting the American public from an unpopular war in Vietnam. They point to the ending of manned missions in the early 1970s, just as the U.S. was ending its involvement with Vietnam. In fact, the budget for NASA, which had ballooned prior to the moon landing, was being necessarily reduced, a fact which had been announced in 1970. The $25.4 billion budget for the Apollo mission was simply not sustainable. Another commonly given reason for a fake moon landing is the Van Allen radiation belts, claiming that NASA would not risk exposing astronauts to high, potentially lethal levels of radiation. Discovered in 1958 by astrophysicist James Van Allen, these donut shaped belts help to shield the Earth from solar storms. Van Allen determined that travel through the weaker regions of the belts would be safe for astronauts, however, especially if done quickly. In the words of British National Space Centre Discovery Director Professor Anu Ojha, consider the act of firewalking. Quote, if you've ever done firewalking, you'll know the one thing you don't do is linger around in the middle of the fire pit. You cross as quickly as you can. From a science point of view, as long as you walk across quite quickly, looking at the thermal conductivity of your feet, you are not going to have enough thermal energy going into the soles of your feet to burn you. You're absolutely fine. Just don't hang around in the middle. Later calculations showed that the astronauts recorded radiation levels of less than 2 rads over their 6-day flight, well below harmful levels. Finally, conspiracy theorists point out the lack of stars in the photographs taken from the lunar surface as proof that the moon landing was a hoax. In response, scientists have pointed out that the landings took place during the lunar daylight hours. A quick glance outside the window confirms that I cannot, in fact, see the stars during the day, other than our sun, of course. I can hear the protests already. But there are no photos other than the ones provided by NASA, they cry desperately. Sigh. It is true that NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter takes high-resolution pictures of the lunar surface from a low orbit. Photos from the orbiter have captured the landing sites and the abandoned descent modules and rovers from the Apollo missions, and even the paths of the astronauts' footprints. Additionally, spacecraft from China, India, and Japan have also spotted these landing sites, providing further independent verification of the landings. Whew, what started out as a short video on the moon landing turned into an odyssey. Thank you for hanging on until the end, but now it's time to put this conspiracy theory to bed. While I lack the expertise of certain celebrities with spotting all things fake, I do feel confident in saying that the moon landing was not a hoax. But what do you think? As always, we are looking forward to reading your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you for joining us on our journey through the cosmos. Catch you next time on Hidden in the Stars.